Stop everything you're doing right now. Your grocery bill is about to explode, and most people have no idea what's coming. I'm talking about a perfect storm hitting our food supply, devastating weather wiping out crops, energy costs skyrocketing, and supply chains crumbling faster than we've ever seen. The result? 20 everyday foods sitting in your kitchen right now are about to double in price within weeks. That morning coffee, your kids' cereal, even basic bread, nothing is safe from this pricing tsunami. While families scramble to stretch budgets and small businesses face impossible choices, the warning signs are flashing red. In the next 10 minutes, I'll reveal exactly which 20 foods are in the danger zone and show you how to protect your wallet before it's too late. You literally cannot afford to miss this. Hit that subscribe button now. Your future grocery budget depends on it. 1. Farm fresh protein powerhouses. Eggs represent one of the most dramatic examples of how quickly food prices can spiral out of control. The current situation facing egg producers creates a cascade of problems that directly impact your grocery bill. Feed costs alone have become a nightmare for poultry farmers, with corn and soybean prices reaching levels that force many operations to reconsider their business models entirely. The drought conditions across major agricultural regions have decimated crop yields, while fertilizer costs have tripled in some areas due to supply chain bottlenecks and international trade tensions. These factors combine to make chicken feed dramatically more expensive, and farmers have no choice but to pass these costs along to consumers. Energy expenses add another layer of complexity, as poultry operations require consistent electricity for lighting, ventilation, and temperature control. With energy prices fluctuating wildly, operational costs have become unpredictable. Avian influenza continues to wreak havoc on the industry, forcing producers to implement strict biosecurity measures that increase daily operating expenses. Many farms are still rebuilding their flocks after previous outbreaks, meaning supply remains constrained while demand continues growing. The consolidation happening within the industry as smaller producers exit the market reduces competition and gives remaining companies more pricing power. Consumer demand for eggs extends far beyond breakfast tables. Food manufacturers rely heavily on eggs for countless products, from baked goods to mayonnaise, creating sustained demand that rarely fluctuates with seasonal patterns. Wholesale prices have already begun reflecting these pressures, with some regions seeing increases of 40% or more in recent weeks. Retailers are preparing to implement these increases in their next pricing cycles, meaning consumers will soon face sticker shock at checkout counters nationwide. 20C. Daily bread dilemma. Bread represents the foundation of diets worldwide, making price increases particularly devastating for families trying to stretch their budgets. The current wheat crisis extends far beyond simple supply and demand, encompassing weather disasters, geopolitical tensions, and energy costs that affect every step of the production process. Drought conditions in major wheat-producing regions have reduced harvests significantly, while export restrictions implemented by key suppliers have tightened global availability. Milling operations face their own set of challenges, with energy costs for processing wheat into flour increasing substantially. Transportation expenses for moving both raw wheat and finished products have skyrocketed due to fuel price volatility and driver shortages. Bakeries must contend with higher ingredient costs, increased utility bills, and labor expenses that continue climbing as workers demand wages that keep pace with inflation. The ripple effects extend internationally, with developing nations experiencing particularly severe impacts as their currencies weaken against major trading currencies. Import costs for wheat and flour have become prohibitive for many countries, forcing local bakeries to raise prices or reduce production. In regions affected by conflict or political instability, bread prices have become a source of social tension as governments struggle to maintain subsidies. Commercial bakeries report that their costs have increased by 60 to 80% compared to previous years, with no relief expected in the near term. Energy expenses alone account for a significant portion of these increases, as bakeries require consistent high-temperature ovens and climate-controlled storage facilities. Insurance premiums have also risen as businesses seek protection against supply chain disruptions and equipment failures. The global nature of these pressures means that even countries with domestic wheat production face higher prices due to export opportunities that make local sales less attractive for farmers. This dynamic creates a situation where bread prices climb regardless of local growing conditions, affecting consumers everywhere. 3. White gold crisis. Dairy products face unprecedented pressure as multiple factors converge to drive milk prices toward unsustainable levels for many consumers. Climate change has created havoc for dairy operations worldwide, with extreme weather events disrupting both feed production and milk processing facilities. Australian dairy farmers have endured consecutive years of floods and droughts that decimated herds and destroyed infrastructure, forcing many operations to scale back production permanently. The situation in major producing regions has created a domino effect throughout global markets. India's dairy sector, crucial for international supply, has struggled with heat waves that reduce milk production and increase cooling costs for facilities. New Zealand, a major dairy exporter, has raised its farm-gate milk price expectations significantly, signaling that international markets should prepare for sustained higher pricing. Feed costs represent the largest expense for most dairy operations, and these have nearly doubled in many regions due to crop failures and supply chain disruptions. Farmers must balance the economics of maintaining their herds against the reality of feed costs that sometimes exceed the value of milk production. Energy expenses for milking operations, refrigeration, and transportation add additional pressure to already strained budgets. Processing facilities face their own challenges, with energy costs for pasteurization, packaging, and cold storage increasing dramatically. Labor shortages in rural areas have forced many operations to increase wages substantially, while regulatory compliance costs continue rising. The consolidation occurring within the dairy industry as smaller farmers exit the market reduces competition and gives remaining producers more pricing power. Consumer demand remains strong despite rising prices, particularly for specialty dairy products like organic milk and artisanal cheeses. This sustained demand, combined with reduced supply from climate-affected regions, creates conditions where significant price increases become inevitable. Industry analysts predict that milk prices could reach levels not seen in decades, fundamentally changing how families approach dairy consumption. 4. Poultry price explosion. Chicken has traditionally served as an affordable protein option for families worldwide, but current market conditions threaten to eliminate this advantage entirely. The poultry industry faces a complex web of challenges that extend far beyond the direct impacts of avian influenza. Processing plants struggle with labor shortages that have forced many facilities to reduce production capacity while increasing wages to attract workers. Sanitation requirements have intensified dramatically following disease outbreaks, requiring processing facilities to implement expensive cleaning protocols and biosecurity measures. These additional steps slow production lines and increase operational costs significantly. Feed costs represent another major expense, with corn and soybean prices reaching levels that make chicken production increasingly expensive for farmers. The broader economic environment has created additional pressures through trade policies and tariffs that affect both imported feed ingredients and processing equipment. Supply chain disruptions have made it difficult to obtain specialized equipment and packaging materials, forcing companies to seek more expensive alternatives or accept production delays. Consumer behavior has shifted as beef and pork prices have reached levels that push many shoppers toward chicken as a more affordable option. This increased demand, combined with constrained supply, creates ideal conditions for significant price increases. Restaurant chains and food service operations that rely heavily on chicken products face particular challenges as they attempt to maintain profitable menu pricing. International markets also contribute to pricing pressure as global demand for poultry products continues growing, particularly in developing economies where rising incomes drive increased meat consumption. Export opportunities make domestic chicken sales less attractive for producers, effectively reducing supply available to local consumers. The combination of these factors has created a situation where chicken prices face upward pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Industry experts suggest that the traditional price advantage of chicken over other proteins may disappear entirely as these pressures continue building throughout the supply chain. 5. Caffeine cost. Catastrophe. Coffee prices face extraordinary pressure as supply disruptions converge with growing global demand to create perfect storm conditions. Weather patterns in major producing regions have become increasingly unpredictable, with droughts in Brazil and flooding in Vietnam severely impacting crop yields. These two countries supply the majority of global coffee production, meaning any disruption creates immediate ripple effects throughout international markets. Futures markets reflect trader expectations of continued supply constraints, with contracts reaching levels not seen in years. Transportation costs have increased substantially due to fuel price volatility and shipping container shortages that affect coffee imports worldwide. Processing facilities face higher energy costs for roasting operations, while packaging materials have become more expensive due to supply chain disruptions. Trade policies have added another layer of complexity, with tariffs and import restrictions increasing costs for coffee importers. These additional expenses flow through the supply chain to wholesalers, roasters, and eventually retail outlets. Major coffee companies have implemented multiple price increases throughout the year, with some announcing their intentions to continue raising prices as costs remain elevated. Export data reveals the severity of supply constraints, with shipments falling dramatically compared to previous years. Arabica coffee exports have declined by more than 20%, while Robusta shipments have fallen nearly 50% in some regions. This reduced availability occurs at the same time that global demand continues expanding, particularly in Asian markets where coffee consumption grows rapidly. Production costs at origin have increased due to higher fertilizer prices, labor shortages during harvest seasons, and increased pest management expenses. Climate change has made growing conditions more challenging, forcing farmers to invest in irrigation systems and shade structures that increase operational costs. These investments, while necessary for long-term sustainability, add immediate pressure to coffee prices that eventually reach consumers. The convergence of supply constraints, increased production costs, transportation expenses, and growing global demand creates conditions where coffee prices could effectively double for consumers worldwide. This situation represents more than temporary market volatility, signaling a fundamental shift in how much people will pay for one of the world's most popular beverages. 6. The Asian grain game changer. Rice markets worldwide are experiencing turbulence that extends far beyond typical seasonal fluctuations. This fundamental shift reflects deeper structural changes affecting global food security. Japan's rice market exemplifies these dramatic transformations, where prices have skyrocketed nearly 100% within 12 months. Poor harvests devastated last season's yields, while earthquake-triggered panic buying emptied store shelves and created artificial scarcity that persisted for months. The ripple effects spread across Asia's rice-dependent economies. India's premium Gobindab variety, once an affordable regional staple, now commands double its previous retail price following catastrophic yield drops. Southern Indian consumers and Middle Eastern importers compete for limited supplies, driving prices to unprecedented levels. These premium varieties represent more than simple commodities. They're cultural touchstones that families refuse to abandon despite financial strain. Climate volatility adds another layer of complexity to rice pricing. Extreme weather events trigger supply shocks that can double prices overnight in affected regions. Heat waves, unprecedented flooding, and prolonged droughts create perfect storm conditions where traditional growing patterns collapse. Research demonstrates that staple crops like rice face increasing price volatility as climate change intensifies, making food security planning nearly impossible for vulnerable populations. Regional policy decisions create additional market disruptions that spread internationally. When Bangladesh opened duty-free import windows, Indian rice prices jumped 14% in just 2 days as traders scrambled to capitalize on arbitrage opportunities. These rapid policy shifts demonstrate how interconnected global rice markets have become, where domestic decisions in one country immediately affect pricing across continents. The convergence of local crop failures, specialty grain demand, climate-driven volatility, and policy interventions creates conditions where rice prices can effectively double without warning, fundamentally altering household food budgets for billions of people worldwide. 7. Liquid gold crisis. Cooking oils face unprecedented pressure as multiple supply disruptions converge with trade tensions to reshape global markets. The situation extends across all major oil categories: palm, rapeseed, sunflower, soybean, and olive, creating widespread shortages that affect every kitchen worldwide. Southeast Asian palm oil production has collapsed under severe drought and flooding conditions that destroyed plantations across Malaysia and Indonesia. These weather disasters eliminated millions of tons of expected production, tightening global supplies when demand remains robust. European oilseed crops face similar challenges, with late frosts and extreme weather reducing rapeseed and sunflower harvests significantly. France and Ukraine, major suppliers of these oils, report yield reductions exceeding 30% in some regions. Traditional growing areas can no longer support consistent production levels, forcing processors to compete for limited raw materials at ever higher prices. These supply constraints occur simultaneously across multiple oil types, preventing substitution strategies that might normally moderate price increases. Trade policy complications amplify these natural supply disruptions. Shifting tariff structures and export restrictions create additional bottlenecks that prevent efficient distribution of available supplies. India's agricultural pivot away from oilseed production toward more profitable maize cultivation threatens long-term domestic oil security, increasing import dependence precisely when international markets face severe constraints. This strategic shift forces Indian consumers to absorb higher prices while reducing global oilseed availability. The FAO's latest food price index reached 2-year highs, driven substantially by surging vegetable oil costs that reflect these converging pressures. Restaurant operators and food manufacturers face particularly acute challenges, as oil represents a critical input across countless products. Home cooks discover that basic cooking operations become significantly more expensive as bottle prices climb toward levels that fundamentally change cooking economics. These pressures create lasting changes in consumption patterns as families adjust recipes and cooking methods to minimize oil usage while maintaining nutritional standards. 8. Red meat reality check. Beef markets face transformational changes that threaten to permanently alter protein consumption patterns across developed economies. United States ground beef prices recently exceeded $6 per pound for the first time in recorded history, while premium steaks command prices above $11 per pound. These increases reflect fundamental supply constraints that cannot be resolved quickly, creating sustained pressure on household food budgets. The perfect storm combines drought-induced herd reductions, soaring feed costs, and persistently strong consumer demand despite record pricing. American cattle herds have shrunk to levels not seen since the early 1950s, representing the most severe supply constraint in 7 decades. Prolonged drought conditions across major ranching states forced producers to liquidate breeding stock rather than maintain herds through expensive feeding programs. This strategic downsizing creates immediate relief for ranchers facing crushing feed costs, but eliminates future production capacity for years. Cattle require extended maturation periods, meaning today's herd decisions determine meat availability through the remainder of this decade. International factors compound domestic supply challenges. British farmers endured the driest summer in over a century, forcing early feeding programs that increased weekly costs by thousands of pounds per operation. Australian steak imports under new trade agreements create pricing pressure for domestic producers while offering limited supply relief. Brazilian beef exports face new American tariffs that redirect supplies toward Mexican and Chinese markets, reducing availability for American consumers just as domestic production reaches historic lows. Processing facilities struggle with unprecedented raw material costs that eliminate traditional profit margins. Higher cattle prices squeeze processor economics while limiting operational flexibility needed to respond to market changes. This creates additional bottlenecks where available cattle cannot efficiently reach consumer markets. The convergence of shrinking herds, climate pressures, trade disruptions, and processing constraints establishes conditions where beef prices could genuinely double for many families, fundamentally changing protein consumption patterns across income levels. 9. The dairy dilemma deepens. Cheese markets worldwide demonstrate how dairy price inflation affects essential food categories beyond basic milk consumption. Commodity exchanges show United States cheddar prices exceeding $2.20 per pound, representing raw cost increases that inevitably reach retail shelves. These wholesale price movements signal broader supply constraints affecting cheese production across multiple varieties. European cheese production faces similar pressures from milk shortages linked to disease outbreaks and regulatory production limits that reduce available raw materials. Export demand intensifies domestic supply pressures as international markets compete for American cheese products. Mexico and South Korea maintain strong import appetites despite higher prices, effectively removing domestic supply and supporting continued price increases. This export demand creates zero-sum competition, where foreign purchasing power directly affects American consumer costs. Trade policy changes add complexity through new import tariffs that increase costs for foreign cheese varieties, forcing consumers toward domestic alternatives while producers face margin compression. Traditional cheese-producing regions confront existential challenges that threaten heritage varieties. Alpine cheesemakers struggle with climate change impacts, labor shortages, and aging workforces that limit production capacity for premium varieties like Fontina and Gruyere. These artisanal products represent cultural traditions spanning centuries, yet economic pressures force difficult decisions about continued production. Climate changes alter traditional aging conditions while labor costs increase faster than product prices, squeezing profitability for specialty producers. Shrinkflation appears throughout dairy aisles, as manufacturers reduce package sizes while maintaining or increasing prices. This strategy disguises price increases while reducing actual value for consumers. Artificial intelligence forecasting tools predict continued price increases through October, suggesting current pressures represent structural changes rather than temporary market fluctuations. The combination of supply constraints, export demand, trade policy impacts, and production challenges creates conditions where cheese prices could effectively double, transforming this protein source from affordable staple to occasional luxury for many households. 10. Binary ground inflation explosion. Potato markets reveal how climate disasters and geopolitical tensions can transform basic staples into luxury items virtually overnight. Russian potato prices nearly tripled within 12 months, with year-over-year increases exceeding 150% as poor harvests, reduced planting areas, and soaring input costs created severe shortages. These price increases became so politically sensitive that government officials publicly acknowledged shortages while arranging emergency imports from Belarus and Egypt to stabilize domestic markets. The Russian situation exemplifies broader global pressures affecting potato production worldwide. Fertilizer and fuel costs have increased dramatically due to supply chain disruptions and international sanctions that limit access to essential agricultural inputs. Farmers face impossible economics where production costs exceed potential revenues, forcing reduced planting that guarantees future shortages. These decisions create self-reinforcing cycles where current high prices encourage reduced future production, ensuring continued price pressures. Processing industry concentration adds another dimension to potato price inflation. Major frozen potato processors face accusations of collusion that artificially inflated prices approximately 47% for products like French fries and hash browns. This market manipulation affects every level from farm gate to restaurant menus, creating widespread inflationary pressure that consumers cannot avoid. Fast food outlets and restaurants find their cost structures fundamentally altered as potato products become significantly more expensive. European and North American markets show similar stress patterns where farm gate returns collapse even as retail prices soar. This value distribution inequality demonstrates how supply chain disruptions benefit intermediary players while squeezing both producers and consumers. Canadian and South African farmers report situations where consumer prices increased 75% while producer margins remained razor-thin, indicating systematic market dysfunction. Climate change intensifies these pressures through extreme weather events that regularly disrupt potato harvests across major producing regions. The convergence of crop failures, market concentration, input cost inflation, and climate volatility creates conditions where potato prices could genuinely double, affecting everything from household meal planning to restaurant profitability. 11. The staple shakeup. Pasta prices are experiencing seismic shifts that extend far beyond temporary market fluctuations. Italy, the global epicenter of pasta culture, faces unprecedented double-digit price increases that have triggered emergency government interventions. Energy costs for manufacturing facilities have skyrocketed, while packaging materials and transportation expenses compound these pressures. The situation reflects deeper structural changes affecting wheat supply chains worldwide. Rising wheat prices form the foundation of pasta's pricing crisis. Global harvest disruptions combined with geopolitical tensions affecting major grain-producing regions have created sustained upward pressure on raw material costs. Italian pasta manufacturers, who pride themselves on premium durum wheat, face particular challenges as specialty grain markets tighten. These quality requirements limit substitution options, forcing producers to absorb higher costs or pass them directly to consumers. Consumer behavior changes add complexity to traditional pasta markets. Growing demand for specialty varieties, whole grain, gluten-free, protein-enriched, and organic options requires significant manufacturing investments. These premium products command higher margins but require specialized equipment and ingredients that increase operational costs. Asian markets show explosive growth in pasta consumption, creating international competition for Italian exports that supports higher pricing structures. Manufacturing consolidation within the pasta industry reduces competitive pressures that might otherwise moderate price increases. Smaller producers struggle with rising input costs and energy expenses, forcing market consolidation that benefits remaining large-scale operations. This concentration allows surviving companies greater pricing power while reducing supply chain flexibility. The convergence of raw material costs, energy expenses, specialty product demand, and industry consolidation creates conditions where pasta prices could genuinely double, transforming this affordable staple into a budget challenge for families worldwide. 12. Sweet market turbulence. Sugar markets present a deceptively calm surface that conceals brewing tensions beneath. Recent price retreats mask underlying volatility that threatens sudden eruptions. Brazil, India, and Thailand maintain strong production levels that create global surplus conditions, yet regional disruptions demonstrate how quickly markets can shift. This apparent stability hides structural weaknesses that could trigger rapid price escalation. Indian sugar markets exemplify this hidden volatility, with prices jumping over 10% within weeks due to drought-damaged sugarcane crops. These regional disruptions spread internationally as global sugar trade interconnections amplify local shocks. Weather patterns increasingly threaten major producing regions, while climate change makes traditional growing seasons unpredictable. Monsoon failures or excessive rainfall can eliminate millions of tons of expected production virtually overnight. European sugar producers face margin compression from import competition and weak regional pricing. This financial pressure threatens future planting decisions, potentially reducing global production capacity when current surpluses are consumed. The industry's capital-intensive nature means production decisions made today determine supply availability years into the future. Producer financial distress could trigger sudden supply contractions that reverse current surplus conditions. Consumer behavior shifts toward natural sweeteners and sugar alternatives create additional market pressures. Food manufacturers increasingly specify cane sugar over alternatives, tightening demand for premium grades. This trend occurs simultaneously with growing health consciousness that reduces overall sugar consumption, creating market segmentation where quality products command premium pricing while bulk sugar faces oversupply conditions. The combination of weather risks, producer financial stress, and changing consumption patterns creates conditions where sugar prices could spike dramatically despite current surplus conditions. 13 Boyson's golden spread crisis. Butter markets demonstrate how dairy inflation affects premium products differently than basic milk. Global butter prices have reached historic peaks, with the FAO butter index climbing over 50% compared to recent years. This trajectory reflects fundamental supply constraints that cannot be resolved quickly. European markets show price increases exceeding 40% in major consuming countries, with governments tapping strategic reserves to moderate consumer impact. American butter markets hover around $5 per pound retail, representing sustained price pressure that affects both household budgets and commercial food operations. French bakers report genuine alarm as butter becomes unaffordable for traditional pastry production. This situation threatens cultural food traditions while forcing recipe modifications that compromise product quality. Professional kitchens face impossible economics where ingredient costs exceed menu pricing flexibility. Dairy farmers prioritize higher-margin products like aged cheeses and whey proteins over butter production. This strategic shift reduces butterfat availability for butter manufacturing while maximizing farm profitability. Supply chain vertical integration means these decisions ripple through entire production networks, creating sustained scarcity for butter specifically. Seasonal holiday demand intensifies these pressures when commercial baking and consumer purchases peak simultaneously. Declining dairy herd sizes due to climate pressures, disease outbreaks, and rising feed costs ensure butter scarcity continues long-term. Unlike other agricultural products, dairy expansion requires multi-year investments in breeding stock and infrastructure that cannot respond quickly to price signals. Current high butter prices reflect this supply inelasticity, where increased profitability cannot immediately boost production. The structural nature of these supply constraints suggests butter prices could effectively double as premium product demand competes for limited butterfat supplies. 14 Preservation price shock. Canned goods face unprecedented cost pressures from multiple directions that threaten to double consumer prices rapidly. Steel and aluminum tariffs create immediate manufacturing cost increases of 9 to 15% for basic canned products, with some estimates suggesting individual cans could rise 18 to 30 cents. These metal costs represent unavoidable expenses for manufacturers who cannot substitute alternative packaging materials for shelf-stable products. Food processing companies report compounding pressures beyond packaging costs. Conagra anticipates 7% product line inflation this year, citing metal tariffs among primary cost drivers. Rising protein costs, energy expenses, and transportation fees create additional layers of price pressure that accumulate throughout manufacturing processes. These increases occur simultaneously, preventing cost absorption strategies that might moderate consumer price impacts. Low-income households face disproportionate impacts from canned goods inflation. These families rely heavily on shelf-stable products for food security and budget management. Canned vegetables, fruits, and proteins represent essential nutrition sources that cannot be easily substituted with fresh alternatives. Food distributors already report supply shortages and price increases filtering through retail channels. Manufacturing concentration within the canned goods industry reduces competitive pressures that might otherwise moderate price increases. Large-scale operations possess greater ability to pass costs through to consumers, while smaller producers exit markets due to margin compression. This consolidation reduces consumer choice while supporting sustained price increases. The convergence of metal tariffs, processing cost inflation, and industry concentration creates conditions where canned goods prices could double, fundamentally altering food security for vulnerable populations who depend on affordable preserved foods. 15 Weihauer's ocean harvest inflation. Seafood markets face transformational pressures from climate change, regulatory restrictions, and trade policy shifts that reshape global protein availability. Ocean warming dramatically reduces catch volumes across species and regions, with Japanese fisheries reporting doubled prices for sea urchin, salmon, and squid due to habitat disruption. These ecosystem changes represent permanent shifts rather than temporary market adjustments. Regulatory fishing restrictions aimed at marine conservation create additional supply constraints. Indian coastal states implement seasonal fishing bans that squeeze supply, triggering price surges of 30 to 60% for prawns, freshwater fish, and pomfret. These conservation measures, while environmentally necessary, create sustained scarcity that supports higher pricing long after restrictions lift. Limited catch quotas prevent market recovery even when fishing resumes. Trade policy complications amplify natural supply constraints through import tariff increases that affect entire seafood supply chains. These additional costs accumulate from fishing vessels through processing facilities to retail outlets. American seafood inflation continues climbing, with fresh seafood prices rising 1.5% recently and crab leading increases despite mounting consumer costs. Aquaculture expansion cannot compensate for wild catch declines due to environmental limitations and infrastructure requirements. Fish farming faces its own challenges from water quality issues, disease outbreaks, and feed cost inflation that prevent rapid production scaling. Climate change stresses both wild and farm seafood production simultaneously, eliminating traditional supply buffers. The convergence of ecosystem disruption, conservation regulations, trade barriers, and aquaculture limitations creates conditions where seafood prices could genuinely double as protein scarcity intensifies globally. 16. The Lunchbox Budget Buster. Peanut butter faces a perfect storm of cost pressures that threaten to transform this childhood staple into an expensive luxury. Major manufacturers like J.M. Smucker report unprecedented ingredient and tariff costs that force multiple price increases throughout their product lines. These companies face impossible economics where rising commodity prices, global trade disruptions, and manufacturing expenses eliminate traditional profit margins. The financial strain extends beyond corporate boardrooms directly into family kitchens. Recent grocery surveys reveal dramatic increases in the cost of simple PB&J lunches, affecting millions of school-aged children who depend on this affordable protein source. Producer price data confirms sustained inflation at manufacturing levels, with no peak in sight for these upward pressures. Peanut farming itself contributes to these escalating costs. Weather disruptions across major growing regions create harvest volatility that ripples through processing facilities. Drought conditions, excessive rainfall, and temperature extremes reduce yields while increasing production expenses. Long-term market forecasts show peanut butter trapped in sustained upward pricing trends driven by emerging market demand, particularly in Asia where growing middle classes embrace Western-style foods. The convergence of agricultural challenges, trade policy impacts, manufacturing cost inflation, and expanding global demand creates conditions where peanut butter prices could genuinely double, fundamentally altering lunchbox economics for families nationwide.